as you prepare to take the course, please understand why Canada chooses to trade, why a Canadian business would choose to export their products internationally or deal with a partner in another part of the world. Understand what are the benefits of doing this, and if you understand why, you can see why globalization's become a trend and why more and more free trade agreements have been signed. Well, here's pretty much a big list of why countries choose to trade. A business might have exhausted the local domestic market and it needs to access a new market in another part of the world to lower costs by purchasing cheaper supplies or finding a country where labor is lower. They may have exhausted the opportunity to get investment in Canada and they need financing from around the world. There might be an opportunity to license their innovation to another part of the world where it can be distributed and sold and they can make more profits. They might wish to assign the distribution rights to another partner who has the know-how to get their product to another part of the world. They might choose to operate as a franchise with many small locations around the world as part of a bigger brand. There's more customers, it allows them to increase profits, and they can grow faster. So the new markets. So Canada, the government of Canada, classifies countries as established markets where there's already significant trade, like Japan, the United States, China, Europe. And they really push trade with these established markets. There tends to be a lot of consumers there. There's a track record of Canadian success, so it's likely in these established markets that Canadian companies will do well. They talk also about broad Canadian interests, meaning it's not established yet. It's not one of the biggest, but there's a potential for growth. There's many consumers, and as more and more businesses choose to operate there, perhaps they'll find success, such as Hong Kong. And then there are specific Canadian interests. That is, there's something about the country that a Canadian company could do well. For example, Brunei. And they would like to facilitate a deal to get Canadian companies into Brunei to get that first mover advantage, to establish themselves and get an edge on the competition. So what would be an example of one of these specific Canadian interests? Well, Brunei, Jerusalem, here you can see where it's located in Asia, just as a small part of Malaysia. It needs oil and gas technology that Canada is an expert in. It needs some agricultural products. You can see there's not a lot of arable land there. We can provide it help with information technology, and it also could use some automobile and aerospace products. So that's been identified as a potential opportunity to get Canadian countries in there, and then they'll be established and hopefully we'll have a very long-lasting, profitable relationship. Well, a big reason is lowering labor costs. Wages in Canada are higher than the rest of the world. Manufacturing wages can be $20, $25 an hour, and they might seek to find a lower wage. A Canadian company might choose to open a branch plant in another country where they open up the factory and they own it in another country for the purpose of finding lower wages. So Gildan is a big Canadian company, but it has to compete with Chinese t-shirt food firms, so it operates branch plants in Honduras and the Dominican Republic where it can receive lower labor costs. You might see a Gildan product and think, oh, well, that's a Canadian one. Well, it also was something that was made offshore and imported into Canada to save on cost. So accessing inexpensive supplies, perhaps a cheaper raw material, like a metal or a lumber, an intermediate good. It could be a Canadian aerospace company needs to have an engine made in another part of the world where it can be assembled more cheaply. or finished goods. That's something that's totally complete and ready for sale. So there's a raw materials, intermediate, finished goods. Those are the three types of goods. And when you can search the whole world for prices, you might be able to find an inexpensive supply. For example, perhaps closer to where the metal is being mined, perhaps an area with a lot of good engineering knowledge that has a very good engine making plant, and lastly, a factory that has lower labor, so the car can be assembled more cheaply. And these global supply chains, you might have noticed during the COVID-19 shutdown that it became a bit harder to get certain types of goods because as the borders were shut down, some of these international logistic arrangements were delayed. So that's an example. Hospitals and healthcare, they imported $5.8 billion worth of medical devices. So if you have or a family member has been to a hospital, and they might have a Siemens MRI machine, and that would be an example of something that came from overseas. It saved the hospital money, and then the Canadians had access to a very high quality medical imaging device. To get financing, you might not have been able to get a bank or a loan to give you a loan, or an individual to give you a loan in your own country, so you would want to go overseas. So foreign direct investment is money from overseas coming to Canada to help Canadian companies grow. And the same thing exists in reverse, FDI from Canada to small companies around the world. So a lot of FDI, foreign direct investment, coming into Canada is the US, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, the UK, so European, China, the US, countries like that. And destinations for our foreign direct investment are the US, islands in the Caribbean, Chile, Australia, the UK. So there's some overlap. Probably the FDI money is coming from one of those developed markets, and some of it might be going out to an emerging market. Canada actually exports a lot of services, and they provide services overseas. IT, financial services, communication is very easy these days, so there's no reason why someone cannot provide a service in any country in the world. And the finance, here's an example. MileVision does traffic control services, like how to have a stoplight that manages the flow of traffic and senses, whether it's time to change the light and so on, and allows a whole city, to manage their traffic during rush hour. And they provide their services. And how many cities are there in Canada that need this? Well, if you can start selling in the US and Germany and Brazil and China, you're accessing more markets, and they can be in Kitchener and Waterloo providing the consultation services to these other countries. So licensing agreements, you give a permission to another company to use your brand name and your proprietary design and your patents, and they might be able to distribute it and make it more cheaply. So they assume some of the risk, and they make it overseas. So for example, Woodland is a clothing and shoe company in Canada, and it doesn't really catch on in Canada. Maybe the Canadians have other shoe manufacturers and other clothing brand names that they prefer. However, it has a license to have its goods, its special designs made in India, and it sells very well there. So in exchange for a fee from the Indian partner, they give their designs, and so they're made in India and sold in India. And it's you think Woodland, oh, that must be totally all Canadian, all domestic market. No, it's an international business. Franchises. Tim Hortons operates franchises around the world. It has not succeeded in every market, but the idea is that it can remain owned by Restaurant Brands International, which is in Oakville, and issue a franchise to anyone around the world. And then on the other hand, a Canadian business owner may choose a brand like Subway or McDonald's and bring it into Canada. So franchises, when an agreement is granted to an individual to use that company's name and services and products for a fee. There might be a way to arrange exclusive distribution rights. That is, partner with a local distributor to give them exclusive rights to the product. And Roots does this in Asia. There's a company that has exclusive rights to distribute Roots clothing in Asia. They do all the arrangements, they find the space, they do the marketing. So the Roots might not know about that area, but they can find a partner who does and give them exclusive rights to distribute it in that area. Joint ventures, you'll hear that term a lot in the course, and that's going to be any type of business where there's two different countries involved. And for example, Canada Goose is a Canadian company, but it is owned partially by Bain Capital, which is an equity firm, and they needed the money from Bain Capital to expand production to countries like South Korea while maintaining their production in Canada. So they chose not to offshore their production. They sought a partner who would give them investment, and they formed a joint venture with Bain Capital to expand into South Korea. Just getting more customers. There's obviously 30 million people in Canada, 35 million people in Canada, and then there's 6 billion around the world. So just by going into the United States, you get 10 times as many customers. And so Canadian companies might seek to expand beyond the domestic market by exporting to suitable foreign markets. So an example, in the last couple of years, Canada-Korea Free Trade Agreement should help Canadian pork and lumber producers find more markets for their goods that they will have sold to Canadians, but they still want to grow, so they might choose to sell their products in Korea. Here is a graph from Statistics Canada from 2018, which was the most recent years, showing the number of companies that export goods to China. So we might think, oh, we only export agricultural products there, but no, there's about 4,000 businesses, and many of them are industrial and technological products, and they export to China because they're looking for that next opportunity to grow their company and increase their profit. And if you're looking at this chart and you're wondering, the light blue, what does that mean? What does re-export mean? Well, what that means is a good is imported to Canada, some processing is done to it, some modification is done to it, and then it is exported to another country, usually one with a free trade agreement or a history of trade. So, for example, a company could import electronics, assemble it into their specialized piece of equipment, and then re-export it to China and as an appliance. So, and it's growing at about 10% per year of Canadian companies choosing to operate in China.